At that point, the American government understood that this was not a little crisis, this was not a temporary crisis, that, to coin a phrase, something had hit the fan. And the government had to step in. And the government did. The result is that all the 10 or 15 biggest banks in the United States are not private banks anymore, and they haven't been for a year. That's the major thing our government has done. Rushed in and guaranteed everything that the private sector messed up. Now let's go through that as we work towards a conclusion. If the government is doing all this, if the government is spending records amount of money, which it is, and giving record amounts of guarantees into an indefinite future for an indefinite amount of money, you ought to be wondering, where exactly does that money come from? So the United States government, in order to pay for this, has had to resort to the only thing left, and that's to borrow from the rest of the world. If you assume roughly a 4% interest rate, now that means, roughly, that $60 or $70 billion a year have to be sent from Washington to Beijing. $60 billion sent by the United States to China every year is much more than our total outlay for all foreign aid to all other countries combined. Are you with me? Is the program of rescuing the banks and spending all this money and borrowing from the Chinese and others, is it working? Well, I think the answer to that is a big not so well. For the average person, for the mass of Americans, it hasn't gotten any better. Unemployment keeps getting worse. The foreclosures keep getting worse. The crises at the fiscal levels of the state all get worse. And indeed, more and more Americans are becoming very aware of it. That some people are getting a lot of help from the government, but I don't seem to be one of them. And the people who are around me, who live in my neighborhood and work in my job, they don't seem to be among those folks either. And you're beginning to see a political separation in America that ought to scare you. Masses of Americans beginning to believe that they are being frozen out, dropped out. It really looks like we've saved the banks and the insurance companies, but the rest of us are on our own. But think on this as a conclusion. In the depths of the Depression, when things got really bad and the American people got very angry. And do remember in the 1930s, the American anger, the mass of people's poverty and unemployment, made them do something they haven't done now, at least not yet. Millions of Americans joined and became active in the socialist parties in our country. And that made a difference. And that frightened Mr. Roosevelt, and it frightened the business community, because these people were saying, the problem is capitalism, and maybe we ought to get rid of it. So suddenly something had to be done, and suddenly Mr. Roosevelt did things. The first thing he did was to respond to the problem of unemployment in a novel way. He hired people. Mr. Obama hasn't done that yet. Mr. Obama keeps talking about stimulating private enterprise to hire more people, which isn't working, hasn't been working for the last 15 months. Roosevelt tried it, didn't work for him either. So Roosevelt came in and said, okay, the government's going to hire the people. Millions of people. This is not some socialist dream. This is, I'm describing to you what we did in our country by a president who was not a socialist, to say the least. The United States never had such a flourishing of cultural activity in its country before, and we've never had it since. But I would go much further. And I'm going to leave you with that. I think an economic system that works in the ways I've just gone through with you, that ends up sending money to China, that leaves people unemployed, that leaves people losing their homes. You know, we are a wonderful country. We now have a record number of homeless people, side by side with a record number of unoccupied homes. We are a country in which we line up the homeless people to stare across the street at the empty homes. This is crazy. What is happening here? A society that does that twice in a major way in 75 years. And there were 12 business cycles between the end of the Great Depression and the crisis now. A system as unstable as this, as costly socially as this, is a system that this population ought to have the courage to question. So maybe now we can have the courage to say, can't we do better? Can't we do better than this? Do we have to live with this? And when I tell them, you know, this moving away from a capitalist enterprise and organizing a collective enterprise, and I said, tell me why you like this job. They said, because I feel really good about my work and my fellows. I don't have to wear those clothes. I can bring a Frisbee. I wear a Hawaiian shirt. And I like this better. And I don't want to go back to that other kind of job. But you know, social systems don't come into being because people are aware of it. Capitalism wasn't set up by people who said, we want to set up capitalism. The word capitalism came much later than the activity that brought it into being. There are Americans who are voting with their feet against the system that got us to this. The stunning thing for me, and that I hope will be at least engaging for you, is the system we have that allows, in the core of the production arrangements of our society, for there to be a fundamental animosity. The businessmen don't want to pay higher wages if they don't have to, because they're better off if they don't. Another way to say it. Americans like democracy. They like the idea that in the neighborhood where you live, in the town where you reside, you shouldn't have people telling you how to live, where to live, when to live. You should have the ability to vote for people, to vote them out of office if you're displeased with them. In other words, the people who are living with the results of the decisions of our community leaders should have power over them. I like that idea. I suppose most of you do. So here's a question. If that's a good idea in the community, how come it isn't a good idea at the workplace? How come? Why do we permit the workplace to be a place where you come, you do what you're told, how you're told, when you're told, where you're told, and when you're done, you go home and you leave behind what you've done, and your say over what's done with that is zero. You accept that. Why? If it isn't working well, if it produces 2 collapses in 75 years and 16 business downturns in between, and if it has half the qualities we've just gone through, what is your loyalty to that system? Well, here's a thought. How about government help for communally organized businesses? Businesses organized by workers. Here's a thought. We could go to the 15 million unemployed Americans and say, here's a government program. All of you that have the gumption, the wherewithal, the desire, you form new enterprises, we'll give you a cheap loan to get you going, to give you a job, to let you get underway because you're trying this new kind of enterprise which we want the American people to look at and have choice about. But ask yourself, as my concluding shot, why have we not questioned the system we live under? Why have we not explored these alternatives? Why have we not faced how we got into this crisis? And why have we not confronted the absolutely absurd way we're trying, quote, to cope with it? If you can't answer those questions quickly and easy, that means you're aware that something is wrong here, and that we'll probably be better off as a nation if we face it and debate it than if we continue to pretend that there's nothing there and to be fearful that zombies or vampires or a terrible storm is going to get us. Thank you very much.